Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. Joining us this week is Mitchel Sellers, CEO of IowaComputerGurus, a company specializing in consultancies and building software for large companies. And, first of all, Microsoft MVP and big expert on the whole Microsoft environment. Thank you for joining us today, Mitchell.
Thanks for having me.
Would you like to start with a quick introduction about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as Luke mentioned, I am a 15-year Microsoft MVP. I'm working primarily in the web and mobile spaces of .NET technology and all things Azure as well, because who doesn't?
Mhm.
My company works primarily with custom application development in the web and mobile space for companies all over the world. And for me, one of the things I love to do is share our experiences, the things that we learn from building things, and always looking to help out the greater development community. So excited to be here.
So the first question, let's start from one step back. I've been a developer for a long time, mostly using open source tools and spaces, but I've never been exposed much to what the Microsoft open source environment looks like. But I know there's a lot there for people who would like to start developing very powerful frameworks and a lot of very interesting stuff. So if you could give us just, I don't know, a bird's eye view of what's there in the open source space from Microsoft.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that is really important for people to understand about, open source in .NET in general, right? I mean, fundamentally, there's the concept that .NET itself is open source. And so things that used to be behind the curtains that weren't in the public eye, things that were, kind of behind the closed doors, and then boom, you got something new. All of that work is being done kind of out in the public now. And so, it's really, really important for folks to understand that, we are working in a world where, Microsoft is doing all of their work outside. And then so with that, we see a lot of open source projects embracing the use of .NET. It used to be that you had to use the paid for versions of Visual Studio and things like that to
Mm-hmm.
develop with .NET technologies. Now we have VS Code, which is free, and people use that, or they use JetBrains Writer, that kind of thing. So at the end of the day, right, the barrier to entry to get into .NET has lowered. And with that, then all of the stuff being public, the problem or thing that's interesting with it is the speed of change has gone from quick to crazy quick.
Oh,
And definitely is something that I don't know that all development teams were completely ready for, personally.
hmm. So what has changed in particular?
So the biggest thing that what I see from a change perspective is when you are working with technology, right? We used to be in a cycle when I first started, right? We would get major updates every 18 months. And then you have a ton of time to run with it, right? .NET Framework, as an example, is supported in its current version by Microsoft until the last support of the Windows version it was distributed with.
Oh,
So for short versions, .NET 4.8 gets security updates, or 4.8.1 gets security updates until 2032, as of right now.
hmm.
So you could become complacent. You could maybe not pay as much attention to updates. Now we're at the point where we're getting regular updates on, a quarterly basis, if not faster. We're getting individual package updates along the way. Visual Studio file new project can be updated from one time that you run a create new project to another, because we have that many updates. Visual Studio releases are coming at a very regular cadence, and they're adding new features. We're not waiting 18 months to get new features. And with that becomes just a tendency that I see in a lot of developers to stay behind, or to accidentally fall behind, because trying to stay up with what's current becomes really, really hard. And with that advancement, we have to at least be aware of it as we're moving forward, so that we know what we're doing, where we need to go, how we need to be able to handle things. And so, from my perspective, that's where that velocity change and the incremental deploy in industry makes it really different. And then with that becomes the support policies, right? .NET Framework has that Windows tied support policy.
Yeah.
.NET Core has a much, much tighter, either the long-term support or the current release, which really gets you, only a couple of years until you need to upgrade to a new version. And that support policy is really something that I think a lot of people glaze over. And, just to be very specific with it, if you build something brand new right now on .NET 7 that was released November 8th of 2022, right? So not all that long ago, its support ends May 14th of this year.
Mm-hmm.
If you build something brand new on .NET 8 that was released November 14th of last year, you have support through November 10th of 2026. It's a much shorter window. It's encouraging for me because it gives us reasons to have our customers do updates and patching, but we have to make
Mm-hmm.
sure our customers are willing to do
Oh
updates
yeah,
and patching.
always. That's a problem.
So lots and lots of changes with everything related to that transition to open source and everybody being able to see what's going on behind the scenes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, being tied to Windows releases makes it easier on one hand if you know and track the kind of changes, but the other hand makes it actually more complicated for people who are not on Windows or don't run Windows. One question I have for you, though, is what is the difference between .NET Framework and .NET Core? Because that has been puzzling me for a while.
Yeah, so .NET Framework is, and version numbering make it really, really hard, right? .NET Framework was originally released back in 2002.
Yeah, it's been there for a while.
Been there for a long time. It is the Windows only framework. It's the original foundation
Oh.
pieces. .NET proper, because they dropped the core name in the later releases, right? So like .NET 8, .NET 7, what we have also effectively known as like .NET Core 1, 3, etc. That is the brand new cross-platform tool set that is leveraging, we can use C#, we can use other languages, but it was a ground up rewrite. There was compatibility layers that were built in, but it was rebuilt with performance in mind. It's what's open source. And that's what all of our current technologies are built on. .NET MAUI, for example, for mobile and desktop application development, that's built on .NET. It makes Googling very, very hard because of those naming differences. Because and you'll hear me mix it up all the time because .NET Core made it a lot easier to be able to say .NET Framework, .NET Core, old and new. But then now that we've dropped the core naming and it's just .NET 8, I do feel that some people think, oh, well, I'm on .NET Framework 4.8. Why don't I just upgrade to 8? There isn't really an upgrade path in a lot of those scenarios. So definitely something to confuse folks.
So when you're developing, first of all, let me say this. Now it sounds silly, but I work outside. I work on applications for customers at SignalWire, so I do a lot of things for that. But most of our core is actually written in C#, which is that will be running on .NET Core, right? That's likely running on .NET Core. We run everything on Linux. It's there's no Windows machines involved.
Okay, yeah. If you're so if you are running on Linux, then absolutely yes. So the one easy way to tell in some cases, right, is .NET Framework was Windows only. It needed to be distributed with Windows. We became cross-platform with .NET Core, and then .NET 6, 7, 8. Those are cross-platform, so we can write C# code and we can run it on Linux, we can run it on Mac, we can run it on Windows without a problem. So that's your one easy tell is if you're running it on Linux, it's .NET or .NET Core, whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it is. I would say, you probably. I mean, you said it, so you probably agree. Is the confusing naming and versioning a barrier to entry? Actually, like at some point you sit down and don't know which one you're supposed to start with.
So I don't know that it's as much of a barrier to entry per se. It is much more, though, a barrier to resolving issues. So right now, right, if you Google how to do something with C sharp and you get taken to Stack Overflow, you get taken to Google search results. It's really important that you look at what was the date that it was posted.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you find an answer that was posted in the early, 2008, 2009, 2012, that probably isn't applicable to you or may not be applicable to you, depending on what you're looking for where you're there. Some of it stays the same because if it's language syntax, right, that's kind of stayed, some of that stayed the same. So I do think that it definitely makes um, confusion for issue resolution. I don't, like I said, I don't know that it makes it harder to start things, but it also makes it harder for projects that are built on one technology versus another to
Mm-hmm.
look relevant. So for example, right, I do some work still with the .NET Nuke open source content management system. It is built on .NET Framework. We don't have a large enough community or financing, right, to make a transition to .NET Core because it is a full rewrite.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean we're dead, right? Microsoft is still supporting .NET Framework until at least 2032. If I switch to .NET 8 today, I only have support to 2026, right? So is it as flashy? Is it as new? Does it have some of the performance features? No, it doesn't. But there's still two different tool sets for different mindsets, right? Um, and you see, like companies have to make decisions, right? I do see companies make decisions based on I can't upgrade a technology platform every 18 months. They just don't have the internal process for that. So I think that we see some of that a little bit as well, where you get that information paralysis of like, how do I actually accommodate um, where they need to go? Because the number one thing that I think that organizations are at least finally completely agreeing to is they don't want to be stuck on non-supported platforms, right? And we've got one more of those big moves coming with the end of support for Xamarin, the older way to do,
Oh
um,
yeah, I remember that.
the older way to do .NET mobile apps, right? Officially goes away next month, and it'll be no longer supported. The apps aren't going to turn into pumpkins or anything, but you're no longer going to really get Microsoft to be like, "Hey, we'll help you if something goes wrong."
Yeah, the that's a good point. The so first of all, you mentioned something that I was about to ask you, so I'll ask for confirmation. You mentioned that going from .NET Framework to .NET Core will be a full rewrite for .NET Nuke. Would that be the case only for that project because of how it's built, or is it in general what you're looking at if you're looking for to migrate from one to the other?
It really depends on your project and your project usage. So in the case of .NET Nuke, a big portion of it is a rewrite because of dependencies on what's known as system.web, which is the old web forms design pattern for web development. That
Mhm.
has no equivalent home in .NET.
Okay.
So you can't we can't just pick it up and move it. Other applications are substantially easier. If you have an MVC project that is a .NET framework MVC project, you can
Hmm.
move those over in a much easier fashion. We've done some projects in as short as a week. Otherwise, it really just depends on the project. Xamarin is another example.
Hmm.
Xamarin to .NET MAUI, it's not a rewrite, but there's a boatload of changes. There's a lot of things that have to change. There's certain things that are no longer supported. There's things that have been rename spaced. So depending on how your project is structured, sometimes it's a rewrite, sometimes it's a lift and shift and change namespaces. It's only a real guaranteed rewrite if you're trying to take anything that is web forms over, because there's no equivalent in .NET. The closest being Razor pages, but even then, everything is still different. So you're redoing that UI component. The good news is it's just that UI layer, right? The underpinnings, for the most part, are reusable and can transfer over quite quickly.
Well, that's Xamarin successor is Maui, right?
Yes. Yep.
What was the main? I mean, if you work with those frameworks, what's the quick rundown of differences between? Because I've worked on some old project in Xamarin, and I'm curious about what has changed. Like, is it much different or just an update?
It is absolutely different. As you
Hmm.
go into Maui now, it's faster. You have more deployment targets. So with Maui, we can build with the same code base against Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android, all with the same application. So definitely expands your deployment capability. The developer experience with hot reload and things like that, where you can run the app and actually make changes without having to recompile, redeploy. We had some of that before, but it works now and it works well. So there's definitely improvements there. The other thing that is massive, as I see with every app that we've moved, it used to be that you had a shared app, an Android project, and an iOS project. So you had three
Hmm.
projects at minimum inside of Visual Studio. If you wanted to put your logo in the app, you needed to put it in the place that Apple wants it in the iOS project, and then you needed to
Yeah.
put it in the place or places where the Android app needed it. With .NET Maui, they do a lot of that magic for you behind the scenes. So you can create an image resource and drop it in there, one file, and at compile time, it will do all of the resizing, copying, transforming, moving it to where it needs to be for the respective platforms. So we've been able to reduce mistakes by, oh, I updated the logo. Oh, well, you updated the iOS one, you forgot to update Android, right? Or things like that. Um, Same thing goes for fonts and other things, right? If you wanted to use
Hmm.
a custom font, you had to put it in a certain place and wire it up a certain way in iOS. You had to put it in a certain place and wire it up a certain way in Android. Well, now you just put the fonts into place, register the fonts. Maui helps you with that. So lots of improvements there. And then all of the other language evolution, right? Support for dependency injection out of the box, all of the developer experience things that you'd be expecting. So it's a really, really big improvement. It
Yeah.
just requires you to, leverage some of those new technologies, and it's been pretty easy for most folks. And then there's a whole new development paradigm introduced, though, as well, with .NET Maui Blazor, which allows you
Mm.
to build Maui apps using a web front end. And that
Oh,
has
that's
been
nice.
invaluable for a lot of our clients that have much more web development experience, but they need the support of a real mobile app, right? They need to deploy on device. They need to access things, whether it be GPS or NFC readers and that kind of thing. And it's introduced something that's made we've been able to make much better app experiences by going and doing a much larger transition away from true Xamarin to Maui, but going from Xamarin to Maui Blazor hybrid. Because then we can build, oh, I want it to look like this on a tablet, this on a mobile device. We do it the same way we do it with web apps that we've been doing for the last how many years. So our
Mhm.
time to development has been drastically improved with Maui.
If you have experience with both, how does the development experience compare to, say, Flutter or React Native? So, which sounds like they're kind of targeting the same market. So, I'm honestly trying to figure out if I should just go and learn Blazor for the next app.
Yeah, it comes down to developer experience, I think, is
Hmm.
where it really comes down. Blazor's big selling point with everything is it's the same tools, right? So with Blazor, you can still go and do JavaScript if you need to do JavaScript for whatever reasons. But for the most part, right, you're still writing C# code. So what I've found is that for those that want to stay in C#, stay with one language set, it's so much better. Um, I've tried Flutter, I've tried React Native and those kinds of things. And for me, it's just stuff that we don't, it's less common for us to do it. The entry point to Blazor was a lot easier because we're
Mhm.
staying in one language. The tools that we have, the static code analysis tools, like all of the things that we have that analyze C# still work. So for us, it's been easier to stay in that Blazor lane if we are going somewhere. And that's where I still really embrace .NET MAUI, right? The move from Xamarin to Maui, I know has had some, negative, oh my gosh, it was such a big breaking change. But we also kind of knew eventually it had to happen, right? It happened with .NET Framework, and Maui was, Xamarin was there. Like eventually, we're always going to have technology evolution. And so for me, it's the pros outweigh the cons as you go forward, and keeping my developers using less disparate tool sets makes my life easier, as the architect, as the person kind of keeping an eye on things when we don't have to context switch as much.
And the whole framework and environment is open source, right?
Hmm. Exactly.
I think from a pure numbers standpoint, I think Visual Studio Code is probably the most successful, might be the most successful open source software in history by
There,
number of installations.
there's a lot of there's a lot of metrics out there. I mean, it's huge, right? And
I think it's playing in the Linux, like the number of Visual Studio Code installations. I think it's playing in the Linux numbers, like Linux kernel numbers.
yeah, and what's interesting too is it's just that adoption, and then what you see is you get the feedback, right? If you go out to GitHub and you look at the feedback on Entity Framework or .NET MAUI or anything else, like you get such community involvement, not just,
Mm.
hey, I have this issue, but hey, I have this issue and I think it's over here, right? And then that gets things in, faster. It makes, and that's part of the reason why um, I would say that the software industry as a whole, right, is accelerating more rapidly, is because we have that. Oh, you don't like it? Why don't you give us a suggested fix? Um, and it opens up new opportunities for companies and developers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I really like the idea, and I think I'm going to go to check it out. People don't immediately. So Microsoft has done a very good job, I have to say, in supporting open source. There's a lot of open source stuff out there. I think they're still, I don't want to say struggling, but they're not marketing some stuff as hard as they should to some people. Because, for example, Flutter took off a lot in open cross-platform mobile development, and I am not a fan. Like Flutter is limited. The environment itself is weird. They use a language that they literally made up for the thing, and it sounds like being able to do something on C# that deploys to more platforms is actually better. So, do you think that's going to be something Microsoft will work on? Is there why do people do not know about Maui, for example?
So that is a really, really good question. And um, I think some of it is just inherently how things are. .NET continues to grow. I mean, we don't see a lot of advertisements about C# itself or other things. And I think there's a true awareness, especially for some of the edge cases, right? The fact that you have .NET MAUI, .NET MAUI Blazor, um, there's nothing that's just like, oh, look at this. There's those kinds of things. If you go start digging, you'll find it. But I would definitely agree. And I think that as I do conference talks and go around, that's the biggest thing that I see is I'm just talking about things that have ran into what we've dealt with, with things that we're building for customers or trainings for my team. And it happens to everybody. Like we were talking right before we started, right? There was, when I first started talking about .NET Core, I did a training seminar and I was talking about the support lifecycle and the importance of updates and that whole 18-month versus 36-month support lifecycle, right? Where .NET 8, is out of support in 2026, .NET 7's out of support this year, roll back a number of years. I had people literally panicked because they didn't know that, and they were running code in old versions of .NET Core in production that was technically non-supported. And I don't know how we fix some of that, right? Because some of it's here are these tools, right? Oh, you like Flutter, .NET MAUI Blazor would be an option for you and stay in the family. Or you are looking at React Native. I think we lack the comparison outside. So if you go look at, I want to use MAUI, you can find great Microsoft documentation that lets you see, here's how MAUI and MAUI Blazor work. You don't see, here's how MAUI Blazor stack up against Flutter. And I think some of that, if I and this is just me guessing, this is nothing that I know or nothing anybody's ever said, but Microsoft is embracing everybody, right? On
Yeah.
Azure, right? We can host anything in Azure. In .NET, we can deploy on Windows and Mac and Iowa and all of that kind of thing. So part of me thinks that it's that being open. They don't want to say, well, we're better than this or we're better than you in this. And I see that even just in renewing a Microsoft certification that I finished yesterday. They talk about, well, Cosmos DB can do this and Azure SQL can do this. And you can do it with C#, you can do it with Python, you can do it with Java. And, they just kind of leave it there. They don't really give you, well, this is better than this. And I think that might be some of it, but I think we lose adoption. I really do think that we get people that go out and Google, I want to build a mobile app.
Yeah.
And they get led to. So I think that to your question earlier, right, about confusion and adoption, I don't know that it's as big of a deal for .NET, .NET Core, .NET Framework. It is a huge deal in the MAUI space. Because also, the name, and not that Flutter makes any sense that that's a mobile app development platform either. But I do think there's some issue there of marketing.
Yeah, because I mean, I've just Googled a couple of random pages. Feels like even the strong integration it has with the rest of the ecosystem, even if you're going to want to go up to Azure for Firebase like features, feels like Maui has a lot of that stuff, like keeping database synchronized or sending push notifications, etc. There's a lot of that, and
It's
it's
hidden.
weird.
There is a NuGet package that you can pull in that will allow you from a mobile device or any other disconnected app to have a completely separate database. And as soon as the internet comes back, it'll auto sync for you. You write no code to do that synchronization process, but you had to find where it was buried in the documentation.
Yeah,
And
it is.
the number of things that I hear from people where they're like, hey, have you used this before? And I'm like, I didn't know that existed, so give me an hour. And then I'm like, this is awesome. Here's a prototype, right? And so discoverability is definitely a problem. And that's why, I write blog posts, right? Maui's new. I just wrote a blog post a couple weeks ago because we deployed a Maui app and it completely failed. And come to find out there was a configuration. We needed to set an environment variable to let it work where we wanted to deploy it. And so, we end up sharing, and that's just some of that thing where it's evolving so fast that the documentation is coming after the functionality is there. And I think that does make a bit of a barrier to entry sometimes.
Yeah,
You have to want to learn.
that's sort of a Microsoft thing, though, because I've been doing a lot of work with Azure. We do a lot of work in cloud in general, and I've been playing with not the AI directly, but the AI support stuff they have, such as the ability to ingest documents, so you can ask questions to it. All of those APIs are actually quite good. they're relatively cheap compared to whatever else you can find in the industry, and they're very effective. The problem is that there's five of them. They're all named slightly differently, and there's nobody telling you which one you're supposed to use because they're all called Azure AI Document something, Document Intelligence, Document Search. Which one do I want? It's very hard to tell. So it's odd how such a good offering is
It,
getting
it,
lost into minutiae.
and I think the secondary piece then goes back to the whole .NET Framework, .NET Core name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if we don't like a name, sticking with a name helps, right? Azure Active Directory getting renamed to Entra ID, right? That's another example where people just get really, really confused. And I don't know how we get around that, right? Companies need to be able to evolve. I'm not going to say one thing or another about what name they picked. My concern is when I look at this from a person that does a bunch of training and things like that is, how do I tell Joe developer that they may be a good developer, but they're not that person that like looks this stuff up for fun? How do I help them do their job every day and understand, well, okay, yeah, no, it was Azure Active Directory. Now it's Entra ID. That switch happened, in 2023. So,
It's
be aware when
recent.
you're searching for things, you might want to look for this term or this term, because even though the article may be a year old, it's still valuable for you. That's the thing for me that's really hard, because you have all the people that have written blog posts and helped with things where like three-quarters of things are still there. But if I'm searching for Entra ID rather than Azure Active Directory, I'm not even going to find an article that was maybe relevant beforehand. And so I do think, again, it comes down to discoverability. And I think that does hurt adoption a bit, because it becomes hard because you're lacking some knowledge that's there, right? I've been in the .NET space really since 2002, 2003, right? Right when things first started. And I've also been one to pay attention. So I remember a lot of that history. And like when I'm searching something and I see results that don't make any sense, I'm like, oh yeah, let me date filter this, or let me look at the old name of what this is. And that's where it's unfortunate for those of us who've been around. Like for me, it's a simple Google search. For others, they may spend a day or two doing it. And that's where like we've implemented rules amongst my team that it's like if you can't find a solution within an hour, ask the rest of the team, because we have found that that's been a way to help us prevent some of the circling of the drain, if you will, of where do I go, and it's because of the velocity of change. Now, with all of that said, it's so much better. It's so much better from a customer perspective to be able to say, hey, you know what? We did your upgrade from .NET 7 to .NET 8, and you know
Yeah.
what? Your app is 50% faster. Right. And we've been able to do those kinds of things because just upgrading the framework has sped things up. And every single release has gotten better and better and better. So it's good change, but it makes the industry a little bit different.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Mitchell, thank you so much. I mean, again, we don't have much focus on what Microsoft has in the open source space, and I feel like I'm doing almost doing wrong towards that environment because, frankly, there's a lot of very good stuff. First thing I'm going to do is going to check out Maui and see if I can get something running with the cross-platform stuff because sounds like it's really.
I mean, honestly, file new project, Maui app. It's amazing just right away. You get a drop down list and it's like run on Windows, run on Android. You can connect an iOS device. It's great. And then when you combine it with things like GitHub Actions, we commit code and we automatically deploy out to App Center for iOS. We can auto push to Google. Like it's so seamless. It's a great experience. So
Well, that's what I'm
definitely
going to
try it
do.
out.
And well, Mitchell, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Mitchel Sellers, CEO and founder of IowaComputerGurus. Reach out to him. Also, if you have questions about flying and learning to fly, it's just his favorite hobby. And one day you'll have to tell me all about it because I'm looking into getting a flight license actually. So it's
Okay, well, we
for
can talk about that anytime as well.
absolutely. And so reach out to him on anything regarding .NET, etc. Go check out Maui. Go check out the new open source Microsoft stuff. It's really good and very interesting. Thank you so much, Mitchell, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for the rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.